one of the questions we get really often is like, why invest in media? Because our thesis is really grounded in building a strong multiracial democracy. And so like folks don't understand how that media piece fits into it and sort of how the ecosystem needs to be expanded to include voices. And for me, it always comes back to like, democracy in action means the majority of the will of the people comes to action, right? So like the majority of people gets to have a voice in how we lead our country, and that voice has to come through a media lens. Like it is how we communicate with people, and it's the strongest pillar of sort of like action that we have at our sort of like disposal. How you feel about that?
I agree. I also think that it's the way that we receive information, and historically the narratives that are told are the ones that reign history. And so for that reason, I think that that's why media and who gets to influence media and who gets to share their stories and who has ownership in that is extremely important for a democracy in action.
Especially when it comes down to the adaptability, and as you mentioned, Jess, there's so many different types of media, and like a person may define media as one thing versus another. Like for us in NMV Ventures, we're looking at all types of media, and we're constantly looking at innovation. What are things we can do to innovate? What are some things we need to see even on a local level?
I love that, Phil, because I think it brings us to the role that New Media Ventures has played in the media ecosystem throughout the years. So New Media Ventures has existed for 13 years, right? And we know that media in the venture capital space, but even in the philanthropy space, historically has been seen as not as impactful, right? That narrative change until like recently, but also not as financially lucrative. It's very risky. And I think that New Media Ventures very early on took that risk, saw it as an important pillar for democracy, but also as potentially financially lucrative, right? And we're like, we can be key players in this space. And we invested in these early stage media innovations, right? And it could be software, it could be other types of tech, it could be platforms, et cetera. And we took, we supported the founders, and we've seen the impacts of those investments throughout the years. And I think the other part of the role that we've played is that we saw the importance of cultural media very early on.
Yes. Culture is so important. I think that I tell this story around sort of like how we don't really understand how culture is connected to power building. And so if we look at the 60s, right, you see people in action, right? People will leave their jobs to go at a picket line, right? But before that, they will listen to Curtis Mayfield, which will like get them in the mind of sort of like action, right? They would eat together and tell stories, right? Like so much of who we are is tied to how we experience our culture and how we communicate about our culture, and it's directly tied to then how we activate together and sort of like move the world together. And when I look at our slate of investments, that is exactly what they're doing. Whether they're like looking at the sort of like the tech side of it or the audience side of it, it's always about, so how do we bridge these gaps and get people talking about democracy in a way, but then also like moving to action.
Right, and that's when it comes down to really being true impact investors. I mean, we're looking at triple bottom line. We're looking at diverse talent. We're looking at impact from the standpoint of financial returns. And we're looking at impact, how it impacts the community, right?
Yeah.
And our role that plays in it. As you mentioned too, around media being so risky for venture investors, we're dispelling that rumor. We're like saying, hey, let's be disruptors here. This model for media may not work traditionally in a venture capital lens. How can we redefine what that model really looks like, where it can be lucrative on both from the founder and the investor? So we have, we've been talking about this for days, for years almost.
It's like we should say
in weeks, So, I mean, these are topics that we love to talk about, and we're constantly asking ourselves this question, like, what role do we play, and how are we being impactful? So, I totally agree.
So I feel like we've been talking about this conversation at a national level.
Yeah.
And now NMV, with our Voices for Democracy lens this year, are going into local media. But why? Like, most folks don't understand why you make that leap from like national to local. I think for me, local is the heart of our democracy, right? Like, local is when you learn about your elections, you learn about like your school board, your roads being paved. That is actual like the most tangible connection that citizens feel with their actual government and their day-to-day lives. And I think that having that connection be restored then drives civic engagement long-term. And I think last year in midterms, we sort of saw so much money being pumped in from these actors who are using particularly Black and brown voices to spread disinformation because they understood the value of local media more so than a lot of folks in the progressive spaces, because they know that if you can get people on the issues that they see and feel every day, then you can convert them into that sort of like point of view. So like, for me, it is always about giving people the tools to be active and engaged in their own lives. And that is what local media does for me.
And especially engaging in that early level, right? Like even as investors, like even our process, we didn't necessarily engage in local media. We looked at companies and organizations that had more of a national level. And what we noticed too was like those traits and like the grittiness in those founders. And we saw how that can be translated even at a local level, which is why we did this project, Voices for Democracy. And I learned a ton. I mean, seeing these founders at this hyper-local level being so like gritty, how they're working together, how they're looking at dispelling misinformation and disinformation, what tools are they using, how are they becoming sustainable. I learned a ton, and it was one of those things that I had to do some reflection on. How do we take this information and how do we move forward in sharing with folks how these founders work and how it can translate in really being innovative?
Yeah, and I think you're touching on kind of what we learned and reflections on Voices for Democracy. So Voices for Democracy was our first state-based open call. And I think I'm proud of our team because we pinpointed this as an area of need very early on, and I think before a lot of other people in our field.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm so happy that there's now so much energy around it. But I think that gives us almost a head up. What's that word? You know I'm bad at idioms. Like a
heads up.
Heads up, like a sprint up. I don't know. Like,
Is it the leg up?
a leg up? Is that a leg up?
It certainly gives us advantage.
There we go. That's the word. Synonyms.
Teamwork.
Okay.
Yeah.
An advantage, right? And understanding what the needs really are in this ecosystem. There was something that you said earlier that reminded me of a conversation we've been having about the definition of local media, right? And how it's seen as, by definition, and in investors' minds and in funders' minds, it's seen as geographical area, right? But we've added a layer to what local media is defined as. Because, and this is an example we talked about, right? I live in Culver City, Los Angeles, out there, Southern California. But sometimes I feel more connected to the Spanish news, right? Than maybe like CulverCity.com. CulverCityNews.com. Like the local news online. Because yes, local politics does impact me, but almost the stuff that's impacting, the Latino, the Mexican American population in the larger area is probably more impactful to me, right? Or is going to affect me more. And that's that cultural aspect that we usually don't look at when we're defining like local media. I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, for me, local media is both relational and location specific, right?
Yeah.
It is both where you are, but also who is in your circle of influence. Like you mentioned being connected to Spanish news. I get a lot of my news from MLK 50, which is a nonprofit journalism outfit out of Memphis, because it speaks to my experience. It speaks to the experience of my family who are still in Memphis and have to visit the local hospital who are overcharging these patients, who have to vote in upcoming elections, right? Like I'm invested in that community. It speaks to me. So being able to bring people together around identity, whether it's like geographic regions, whether it's around gender, or hell, even if you like to bake, and you can build a community about baking, and then that community then leads to conversations around sort of like what's being put in our foods. Like that is still power building, and for me that is still local communities, because it's connecting people and meeting where they are and giving them the tools to take action, which is what news is.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that, because of baking, right?
Yeah.
So we've seen actual VCs, right, venture capitalists, who have made the entire funds around this concept of taking these influencers, right, in baking, in cars and mechanics,
Yeah.
right, taking their following and then building huge businesses around it because of their power of influence. But we're not replicating that model, or it's not seen as valuable for media or even journalist influencers, right? So it's interesting how VCs are seeing value in followings, in influencers, in content creators, and the trust that they're building with their audiences, et cetera. But for some reason, there's a disconnect between the value of those audiences and the value that news journalists or other types of progressive influencers get. So anyway, I just to bring that
right.
up. Yeah.
And to bring that up too, like that's interesting. One of my fears and even concerns with VCs doing that, really going directly to those creators and those influencers, is the power of like that dollar and influencing that creator to share news on just their behalf, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have a VC that's like putting up $1 million for this founder, that VC can influence what that founder does and says to the market, right? So what's our responsibility in making sure that doesn't happen, right? How do we empower those founders to make sure they have more sustainable business models where they may choose to take this money or not? Either way, we want to make sure the news and the data and the information is accurate, is trustworthy, and is transparent. So,
and I think you're speaking to the reason that, personally, I wanted to be an impact investor at the early stage. One, it's a lot riskier, and so that there's some fear around that, right? But the primary reason is because I knew, I had worked in corporate and a tech company, and I was early on, but I saw how difficult it was, even when, you had the ear of the CEO and you had access to, basically everyone at a small company. It was so hard to implement change, right? Even if everyone believed it, there was still, processes and approvals and, what's X person gonna think, what's investor gonna think, et cetera. And so when I left, I was thinking to myself, where can I have the most influence, right? And building the future that I wanna see. And it was either start my own thing and
Starting things, Jess.
it's like, I don't know, I'm too old for that now. Or early stage investors, and I know VCs know that, mm-hmm. because you have the ear of the founders as they're building out their companies and their organizations very early on. And you can really have an impact on the direction of their company, and that's true for media investments as well.
I feel like that's the point of why we're also doing media in early stage, right? We're seeing so much disruption right now in media. I think that we're at the age of one of the most transformative media moments of our generation. And we're trying to build the media institutions of tomorrow. Like 10 years from now, a lot of legacy news organizations, a lot of legacy journalism organizations, a lot of networks may not exist in the same way, right? So who's going to be our shepherds of culture and of engagement and the power of the voice for tomorrow, that's building using the tools of today, building using the modalities that's going to change over the next years? We have to start that early. We can't wait till that moment gets here and then we don't have control of it. Like, that's the power of early stage investment. But sort of like thinking about where we've been and even this shift of local news, how do you think that this is going to affect our investment thesis moving into next year and beyond? And I'm looking at you because, one, you run our investments, right?
Well, funny, the one thing I was thinking, I was like, man, we are risk takers, because we did early stage investing, which is already risky, right?
One.
But then we added local media.
And diverse founders, teams.
Well, no one can say we're not risk takers. Right? We're not. We are innovative. We're okay with like leading the pack.
Yeah. So
that's great. I think for us, like Phil was mentioning, there's a lot of lessons that we learned through Voices for Democracy, and I'm so glad that we did it, but specifically around, the deep need and existence of these outlets, right? And the innovation happening in these outlets. I think that was one of the questions that we had. We had a soft hypothesis going into Voices for Democracy that these Black and brown and other news outlets existed in these states, right, that were trusted messengers, or that could be trusted messengers to their communities, but we didn't have necessarily a lot of data to back that up.
Yeah.
And now we do, right? And it got blown out of the water. I think over 50% of our pipeline was Black and brown.
Yeah.
In these 7 states. I think we have a lot of lessons learned in that there's a lot of work to do with the for-profit investments, with entrepreneurs and founders in these spaces who are facing a lot of challenges, like lack of funding, lack of trust from funding partners, et cetera. I think that's a gap that we can continue to fill. And so for next year, I think specifically with Voices for Democracy, we're focusing on portfolio support and cohort support, and really building that out for them and seeing them as our experiment for what's to come and what should happen, and as a model for what should happen in local media, and the role that impact investors can play in that. As far as our actual investments, we're on a road to 150 investments.
Ooh.
So I think for next year, we are still digging deep into media, specifically media tech, media infrastructure. We've done a lot of work in cultural media and media platforms, and I think we need to take a step back and also invest in tech and infrastructure, especially as we see that those investments in our sector are waning. And so we need to step in and fill that gap for our founders. And political tech. It's still democracy tech, civic tech, political tech.
Yeah, I think that we're still seeing so many gaps on the political tech side, specifically in campaigns. Like there's still data availability, tech availability, particularly for in-state campaigns. We're seeing gaps there. I think there's so much technology around AI that's coming up, and folks don't know how to integrate that. And I think that we are in this space too, where we need to be able to maximize as many resources as we can to be more efficient with how we run campaigns. And so upskilling folks, making technology available to that space is going to be really critical for this year and for beyond. So I'm excited to see the civic tech investments we're going to have this year. You mentioned the road to 150. I'm really excited about that as investors. I mean, for the last 14, 15 years, we've been investing in these companies that are literally holding up the infrastructure for progressive advancement in this country. From media to civic tech to organizing, these folks have existed, but beyond just the role they play, I think there's so much power to gain, so many lessons learned to be gained from that space. And so I'm really excited about getting to that point in our sort of history and what that means for the movement and the next phase of it.
Yeah, you mentioned like their role and as well as our role too, from the education standpoint, like us educating our portfolio founders and other founders in general, like how AI is used, how it can be used as a tool, but also for investors and folks who has questions around, is this a particular sector I would like to invest in?
Yeah.
What type of questions should I be asking? So for us, I think our role is like being an educator on both sides, from the founder and the investor. So really looking forward to doing more of that for next year, especially as we get on this road to 150.
Yeah, and bring other people with us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, let's get some more money in this space.
Yeah.
To your point around sort of being lucrative, we've made some really great investments that have both impacted the world that we live in, but also have generated some returns that I think is important for sustainability.
Yeah.
And so we want more folks in with us. We want to definitely bring in more angels into the space, and more folks putting more money, particularly in local media, as we begin to expand that ecosystem. That's going to be crazy.
Yeah. And we want more risk takers, right?
Yeah.
In this power building game.
The game of life.
The game of power building. The journey, right? And the journey with us.
Yeah.
We need people who are thinking about different structures, who are willing to take that on with us. So how are we not just playing the game, right?
Yeah.
But really actually like changing it and like destroying it and building new ones.
Just a
right?
destroying.
Destroying. Sometimes you gotta tear it down.
Listen,
You know?
to that point, I would put NMV's pipeline up against anybody's in the country. And I think the things that people are building and creating, I think we have the greatest amount of tech talent available to us in the history, right, of America. I think people are more motivated to build things. Like, we've taken away their ability to buy houses and to like live without student loan debt and all these things. We made it so hard for people to live, and to see so many young people and experienced folks putting their talents to the use of changing the systems to be more equitable is so fascinating. And I'm excited about what we're seeing, and I want more people to the point of like risk, like bet on those folks. Like, those are the people who are going to be leading our country in 20 years. Those are the people who are going to be leading our economy, thinking about the future of work, the future of jobs, the future of our climate. Like, those are the people we should be putting money in, who are thinking radically differently about these things. And if we don't take those risks, we're going to be stuck in the same place having the same conversation in the next 15 years.